All three of today's readings are either about baptism or they contain baptismal imagery. As Peter notes, the great flood of Noah's story was understood by the early Christians to be a type or a scriptural allegory which prefigured Christian baptism. Indeed, for the first Christians, Old Testament stories were always interpreted in just that way. There were a very few early Christians who thought that we should just throw out the Old Testament. But the church decided instead that it should be read and interpreted allegorically in a manner that was consistent with the revelation of God's love in Jesus Christ. Well, Noah's flood prefigured baptism precisely because in the flood, as in baptism, the old and sinful ways of the world are washed away. Not, as Peter is quick to point out, so that we can go out and get dirty again, but in order to purify our conscience and purify us of sinful habits so we can rise born to a new way of seeing the world and interacting with it. And just as Noah came through the waters of the flood in order to start a new world, so we rise from the waters of baptism, dead to the old, and born into a new life devoted to following Jesus and committed to nourishing the Christ within. But the purification of baptism does not in any way lift us above the troubles of the world. Indeed, right after Jesus is baptized, Mark tells us that the Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan, to live with wild beasts, to be ministered to by angels for 40 days. That's really a pretty good description of what happens to everybody who is baptized. We rise from the spiritual purification of baptism only to be thrown back into the world, confronted by all the same old temptations that always plagued us, and when we need it, to be spiritually nourished by angels of the Lord, not all of whom I can tell you will be, strictly speaking, celestial beings. A lot of people think that if you're blessed by God, that means you're never going to be subject to the trials and tribulations of the world again. God's blessings are worldly, and God's curses are worldly curses. That's the central idea of the prosperity gospel. Hogwash. The notion that God blesses good people with worldly blessing, well, should have died on the cross with Jesus, who did not reap any worldly blessings for his faithfulness. Bad things do happen to good people. And you might have noticed, although that you are probably baptized, as nearly all of us have been, the world remains a place of testing and trial for us. Simply put, the real blessings of a deep relationship with Christ are not worldly blessings. They are spiritual blessings which bless us, and through which we as Christ's ambassadors are called to bless the world. Now, the question of why God allows evil to exist in the world is one of the hardest questions that Christians have to face. You've no doubt heard people ask, if there's really a loving God, then why do innocent children suffer from hunger or disease? What about natural disasters like hurricanes and fires and floods? What about the Holocaust? I'd add, what about the cross? I don't presume to understand God's ways of guiding our ongoing development and evolution, but would our lives really be better off if God had spared Jesus the suffering of the cross? I don't think so. Moreover, I can think of a number of disasters in my own life, the destruction of my family home and loss of our family farm, for instance, which in the end forced changes that made my world better. For example, had a tornado not destroyed our home, there's no way I'd be living here in Oregon, because I could have never left Oklahoma if I were still tied to that place where my family had been rooted for 3 generations. We really lack perspective to judge God's purposes when bad things happen. The prophet Isaiah reminds us that God is the ultimate source of good and evil. In the 45th chapter of Isaiah, God says, I am the Lord and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. And yet, God does all these things with a loving purpose in mind. In the very next sentence, he goes on to say, "So you heavens rain down my righteousness. Let the clouds shower it down. Let the earth open wide. Let salvation spring up. Let righteousness flourish within it. I, the Lord, have created it." And then he follows this with a warning about those who want to question God's judgment. Woe to those who quarrel with their Maker, those who are nothing but potsherds among the potsherds on the ground. Does the clay say to the potter, "What are you making?" Does your work say the potter has no hands? Woe to the one who says to a father, "What have you begotten?" or to a mother, "What have you brought to birth?" We humans are only able to judge good and bad with respect to what's good and bad for us. We're really not able to see the bigger picture of what might be best for God's creation. And faith, in a very large measure, is about trusting in God's ultimate beneficence, no matter what is going on. Learning to trust God, to have faith that in all that happens, God is working out the divine purpose. That is a very big part of the Christian journey. On Wednesday of this week, the church moved out of the season of Epiphany into the season of Lent, though it really feels to me as if Lent began in February of last year and is still ongoing. Anyway, in ancient times, they didn't have a Lenten program the way we do. In ancient times, Lent was the program. Lent's the time in which we focus upon our own spiritual development. The idea that during this time we look at ourselves honestly to see where our ideas, our attitudes, our behaviors fail to manifest the presence of Christ within us. The point, though, is not to end up in self-recrimination and despair for our failings and inadequacies. The point is to identify those dark places in our hearts and to spend time intentionally inviting Christ to fill them with light. Lent is patterned on Jesus' 40 days of trial and temptation, of trusting himself entirely to God's purposes, no matter what was going on. That's precisely what Jesus was doing in the wilderness for 40 days. Now, 40 is a significant number in the Bible. For example, imagine 40 days on an ark being tossed around by the sea while the world outside is being destroyed. That's a pretty good metaphor for putting yourself in God's hands during difficult times. Or remember the 40 years wandering through the wilderness, shedding the habits of slavery, learning instead what it takes to become neighbors to one another. And finally, Lent recalled the 40 days in the wilderness where Jesus himself, in Mark's short version, is tempted by Satan and ministered to by angels. Again, looking into the darkness for the purpose of allowing the light to fill it. So the season of Lent is always 40 days, except that it really isn't. If you count it all out, you're going to find that Sundays don't count. Sundays are always Easter celebrations. They are also feast days, and practically speaking, Sundays are days off during Lent. Now, the funny thing about Lent is that despite its somber outward appearance, I've heard serious spiritual people describe Lent as their favorite season of the Christian year. Why? Well, because those who do adopt the traditional practice of self-examination, studying Scripture and prayer for direction, making room in their hearts for just a few moments a day to practice letting Christ's light flow into them and through them, those people have often found Lent a time of deep transformation. And every transformation in us that draws us closer to God is, in the end, a true blessing and a delight. So why does Lent focus on the dark things like injustice, suffering, our inner struggles? Well, the simple answer is so that we can uncover them and let them be filled with light. The crucifixion of Jesus is arguably the darkest moment in human history. This is the moment of humanity at its worst. Not just rejecting God, but mocking and rebuking and trying to kill God. This moment also represents that time in human history when God also was most profoundly present and revealing how much love there is in the universe for us. Now you have to use the inner eye to see that presence in the image of the cross, and that takes practice. Hence, the need for the annual refresher course of Lent. Lent is about learning to see that God is present not only on Easter morning, but also in the depths of Good Friday's despair, without which Easter would never have happened. So when you learn to look at the cross and see the very human and horrifyingly vulnerable moment of history it puts on display, you're only seeing half the picture. When you begin to see the fullness of love and the full power of God present in those moments, then you'll experience for yourself the true peace of God which passes understanding, even in the worst trials and tribulations of life. Lent is a time for personal spiritual development. Its purpose is not to instill existential despair, but to facilitate our transformation into a people who are ever more Christ-like, ever more joyful and loving, and ever more involved in creating a world in which God's kingdom may be on earth as it is in heaven. God bless you in this season of Lent.